Hello everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us for another video from the Power and Conflict collection. Okay, so we are now going to have a look at Remains. This is the next one on the list by Simon Armitage, and to be honest, perhaps one of the easier poems as well within this collection, usually as well with students when I am looking to get them acquainted and familiar with some poetry. I'd like to get started with some easier poems, and this is perhaps one of the ones I would like to start off with. So, relatively simple, straightforward, also perhaps a bit more recent as well, and therefore a lot of people could perhaps relate to this. For example, with some of the more traditional poets, you would find a lot more references to nature, which perhaps can be a little bit more challenging sometimes. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this poem and what it's about. So this is the account of a soldier, Guardsman Tromans, and he is someone who was part of the Iraq regiment. Well, he was serving in the Iraq War. Came from, of course, Britain's a British soldier, and he is someone who perhaps gives us an account of really a day, an occasion, as it mentions in the first line, when he went out, and of course, he and a group of other soldiers were on patrol, and they shot a man who they believed to be running away from a bank raid. And they were unsure as to whether or not he was armed, and they just shot at the man and killed him in a very brutal way, and they didn't really give it much thought. However, when this particular soldier goes back home, he's back on leave, then he thinks about really what takes place, or perhaps the say guilt begins to kick in. He starts to reflect, and he seems to be really traumatized by what has happened, and clearly seems to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD. It seems to be carrying a lot of those symptoms, just like perhaps a lot of other um, soldiers, ex-soldiers would perhaps suffer with as well, whether it's a more recent war like the Iraq War or um, the World Wars as well. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the quotes then. So as I mentioned, it's relatively straightforward and not too difficult. So I would say, if you do have the opportunity to try and bring this into your answer, then this is something that is advisable. Okay, so let's start off with the first line. So on another occasion we get sent out. So first line, so on another occasion. So just really giving the idea that as he's talking is on another occasion. So this is not like the occasion or that day, which probably you may think of, given that he's killed someone, and okay, yes, soldiers would kill, but if they feel that they've taken a civilian's life um, without any cause, then we can imagine that it would really weigh on them more or less straight away. However, it seems that within perhaps the war zone, and this is one of the effects of conflict, that people are not really in tune with their morality, and they almost just perhaps are desensitized by some of the crimes and the things they are doing. So this is something that's mentioned here. It's almost like a story that they seem to be um, really giving here, and it seems as though we as readers are perhaps just listening to this account. It could be potentially as if he's opening up to um, a psychiatrist, perhaps, maybe say within therapy or so, because as you will find that early on, just perhaps as with most conversations, perhaps when they are speaking about something, it tends to be relatively mild or perhaps not too brutal initially, providing more details of the context. And then as they begin to talk about really what happens, then they open up more and the emotions and the feelings pour out a little bit more. And this is what you see, for example, the third stanza, and as it rips through his life, and then we've got the onshore one there as well. Okay, so that's something that you may want to talk about, and of course start off with that. The next quote we have, key quote, and tosses his guts back into his body. So this is very graphic and very gory there as well. So it doesn't really seem nice at all when you, of course, think about it, and it seems to be really showing how they did not value life at all, tossing their guts back into their body, and the way perhaps they are so nonchalant about it, it's so casual. It almost gives the impression that this is something that is very common. They would perhaps just look to do this, if they see a dead body on the side of the street or something like that. They would just perhaps be more concerned with having a tidy street, perhaps almost to give the impression that, hey, um, we have not really made a mess, and look, after the British soldiers have arrived in this neighborhood, then they have kept things nice and clean and so on. So it seems to be really inhumane, and of course, we can say this links back to the effects of conflict and what conflict can do. Really just strips away the humanity of people. So the tosses his guts, as I say, the tosses like that we have is, could say, colloquial expression as well, and he does bring a lot of those in as well, which makes it seem a lot more natural and something that just allows us to relate to guardsman Trowmans as well, so the soldier. So some of the other some more colloquial terms we have is "and I swear," and one of them legs it up the road. That's in the first stanza. So that's something, as I say, it's very gory and just makes it seem like the individual is just worthless and piece of rubbish almost. Perhaps the way you may just dispose of or throw like a piece of a packet of crisps or something like that on the ground. Seems to be very similar. Okay, finally, rather, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So you can talk about this being a intertextual reference as well, perhaps to Macbeth as well. So with Lady Macbeth, perhaps how she is also um, suffering with immense guilt, and of course the blood that's in her hands, and very similar to Lady Macbeth as well. We can just perhaps assume, or perhaps it's almost given the idea that this is going to be the same fate of this soldier as well. That the guilt is just going to get too much for them, and they may just end up taking their life. And again, this goes back towards war and the effects of war and conflict. So the my is something that's quite interesting. You may just want to focus on that there. So his a bloody life in my bloody hands there as well. So of course the bloody would have been in reference to the individual. So the person who's running away. So of course his life, which is bloody, and of course his hands as well, that are tainted with blood. But the my, just going back to that, is quite different to the earlier language used. So if you look at, say, for example, stanza 1, on another occasion we get sent out, and then all three of us open fire in the second stanza. And of course from the third stanza it seems to be I, but here it really seems to be really taking ownership here of what he has done. And he feels completely responsible for this murder that took place. Okay, so those are some of the key quotes there, and some of the other ones, probably armed, possibly not. So there's another mention of this on line 22, which is probably armed, possibly not. So a repetition there as well. So the repetition just perhaps really gives us the idea that he is replaying these events as well within his mind. So it seems to be just um, repeating. And of course, this is classical of anyone that is suffering with PTSD. And the next quote, not really rich in terms of language, but I find it's relatively easy and memorable to understand, which is, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. So that's something that's quite interesting there. The drink and the drugs will flush him out. So the drink and the drugs just giving us an idea in terms of the supposed coping mechanisms of soldiers. Um, they are turning to drink and drugs. Again, going back towards the effects of conflict. And also there the flush as well. So just trying to flush, just like you'd have where typically people are perhaps flushing something, then it's to emit um, something that is, perhaps in the case of excretion or so, you'd have something that if it remains in your body, interesting. Come back to the title, then it can really be poisonous as well, and ultimately the process of excretion is necessary, and this is the case really here as well, that he feels that he really needs to go through this process and sort of cleanse his body or soul really of the um, murder that took place. However, nothing seems to be working. Drink, alcohol, drugs don't seem to be working as well, and I say really struggling with having the thoughts of this man that he killed in his mind. Okay, so those are some of your quotes. There's quite a lot here as well. For example, you've got the Volta with end of story, except not really, line 17. That's something also I feel it's quite interesting there as well. But I think that will do for now. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope you found it useful. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care and bye for now.